Chapter 3, Part 2 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Seidel. The Mystery of 31 New Inn, Chapter 3. A Chiels amang ye, takin' notes. Part 2. Something of this kind must have happened to me now. Preoccupied as I was by the condition of the patient, the professional habit of rapid and close observation caused me to direct a searching glance at the man before me. It was only a brief glance, for Mr. Weiss, perhaps embarrassed by my keen regard of him, almost immediately withdrew into the shadow, and my attention seemed to be principally occupied by the odd contrast between the pallor of his face and the redness of his nose, and by the peculiar stiff, bristly character of his eyebrows. But there was another fact, and a very curious one, that was observed by me subconsciously and instantly forgotten, to be revived later when I reflected on the events of the night. It was this. As Mr. Weiss stood with his head slightly turned, I was able to look through one glass of his spectacles at the wall beyond. On the wall was a framed print, and the edge of the frame, seen through the spectacle glass, appeared quite unaltered and free from distortion, magnification, or reduction, as if seen through plain window glass. And yet the reflections of the candle flame in the spectacles showed the flame upside down, proving conclusively that the glasses were concave on one surface at least. The strange phenomenon was visible only for a moment or two, and as it passed out of my sight it passed also out of my mind. "No," I said, replying to the last question, "I can think of no way in which he could have effectually hidden a store of morphine. Judging by the symptoms, he has taken a large dose, and if he has been in the habit of consuming large quantities, his stock would be pretty bulky. I can offer no suggestion whatsoever." "I suppose you consider him quite out of danger now?" "Oh, not at all. I think we can pull him round if we persevere, but he must not be allowed to sink back into a state of coma. We must keep him on the move until the effects of the drug have really passed off. If you will put him into his dressing gown, we will walk him up and down the room for a while." "But is that safe?" Mr. Weiss asked anxiously. "Quite safe," I answered. "I will watch his pulse carefully. The danger is in the possibility, or rather the certainty, of a relapse if he is not kept moving." With obvious unwillingness and disapproval, Mr. Weiss produced a dressing gown, and together we invested the patient in it. Then we dragged him, very limp but not entirely unresisting, out of the bed and stood him on his feet. He opened his eyes and blinked owlishly first at one and then the other of us, and mumbled a few unintelligible words of protest, regardless of which we thrust his feet into slippers and endeavoured to make him walk. At first he seemed unable to stand, and we had to support him by his arms as we urged him forward. But presently his trailing legs began to make definite walking movements, and after one or two turns up and down the room he was not only able partly to support his weight, but showed evidence of reviving consciousness in the form of more energetic protests. At this point Mr. Weiss astonished me by transferring the arm that he held to the housekeeper. "If you will excuse me, doctor," said he, "I will go now and attend to some rather important business that I have had to leave unfinished. Mrs. Schallibaum will be able to give you all the assistance that you require, and will order the carriage when you think it safe to leave the patient. In case I should not see you again, I will say good night. I hope you won't think me very unceremonious." He shook hands with me and went out of the room, leaving me, as I have said, profoundly astonished that he should consider any business of more moment than the condition of his friend, whose life even now was but hanging by a thread. However, it was really no concern of mine. I could do without him, and the resuscitation of this unfortunate half dead man gave me occupation enough to engross my whole attention. The melancholy progress up and down the room recommenced, and with it the mumbled protests from the patient. As we walked, and especially as we turned, I caught frequent glimpses of the housekeeper's face, but it was nearly always in profile. She appeared to avoid looking at me in the face, though she did so once or twice, and on each of these occasions her eyes were directed at me in a normal manner, without any sign of a squint. Nevertheless, I had the impression that when her face was turned away from me she squinted. The swivel eye, the left, was towards me as she held the patient's right arm, and it was almost continuously turned in my direction, whereas I felt convinced that she really was looking straight before her, though of course her right eye was invisible to me. It struck me, even at the time, as an odd affair, but I was too much concerned about my charge to give it much consideration. Meanwhile the patient continued to revive apace, and the more he revived the more energetically did he protest against this wearisome perambulation. But he was evidently a polite gentleman, for, muddled as his faculties were, he managed to clothe his objections in courteous and even gracious forms of speech singularly out of agreement with the character that Mr. Weiss had given him. "I thank you," he mumbled thickly. "Very good. Takes much trouble. Think I'll lie down now." He looked wistfully at the bed, but I wheeled him about and marched him once more down the room. He submitted, unresistingly, but as we again approached the bed he reopened the matter. "Quite sufficient, thank you. Get back to bed now. Much obliged for all your kindness." Here I turned him round. "No, really, I'm feeling rather tired. Should like to lie down now, if you'd be so good." "You must walk about a little longer, Mr. Graves," I said. "It would be very bad for you to go to sleep again." He looked at me with a curious, dull surprise, and reflected a while, as if in some perplexity. Then he looked at me again and said, "I think, sir, you are mistaken me, Miss—" Here Mrs. Schallibaum interrupted sharply. "The doctor thinks it's good for you to walk about. You've been sleeping too much. He doesn't want you to sleep any more just now." "Don't want her sleep. Want her lie down," said the patient. "But you mustn't lie down for a little while. You must walk about for a few minutes more. And you'd better not talk. Just walk up and down." "Well, there's no harm in his talking," said I. "In fact, it's good for him. It will help to keep him awake." "I should think it would tire him," said Mrs. Schallibaum. "And it worries me to hear him asking to lie down when we can't let him." She spoke sharply and in an unnecessarily high tone, so that the patient could not fail to hear. Apparently he took in the very broad hint contained in the concluding sentence, for he trudged wearily and unsteadily up and down the room for some time without speaking, though he continued to look at me from time to time as if something in my appearance puzzled him exceedingly. At length his intolerable longing for repose overcame his politeness, and he returned to the attack. "Surely I've walked enough now. Feeling very tired. Am really. Would you be so kind as let me lie down for a few minutes?" "Don't you think he might lie down for a little while?" Mrs. Schallibaum asked. I felt his pulse, and decided that he was really becoming fatigued, and that it would be wiser not to overdo the exercise while he was so weak. Accordingly I consented to his returning to bed, and turned him round in that direction, whereupon he tottered gleefully towards his resting place like a tired horse heading for its stable. As soon as he was tucked in I gave him a full cup of coffee, which he drank with some avidity, as if thirsty. Then I sat down by the bedside, and, with a view to keeping him awake, began once more to ply him with questions. "Does your head ache, Mr. Graves?" I asked. "The doctor says, does your head ache?" Mrs. Schallibaum squalled, so loudly that the patient started perceptibly. "I heard him, my dear girl," he answered with a faint smile. "Not deaf, you know. Yes, it aches a good deal. But I think this gentleman mistakes—" "He says you are to keep awake. You mustn't go to sleep again, and you are not to close your eyes." All right, Pullen, keeping 'em open." And he proceeded forthwith to shut them with an air of infinite peacefulness. I grasped his hand and shook it gently, on which he opened his eyes and looked at me sleepily. The housekeeper stroked his head, keeping her face half turned from me, as she had done almost constantly, to conceal the squinting eye, as I assumed, and said, "Need we keep you any longer, doctor? It is getting very late, and you have a long way to go." I looked doubtfully at the patient. I was loath to leave him, distrusting these people as I did. But I had my work to do on the morrow, with perhaps a night call or two in the interval, and the endurance even of a general practitioner has its limits. "I think I heard the carriage some time ago," Mrs. Schallibaum added. I rose hesitatingly and looked at my watch. It had turned 11:30. "You understand," I said in a low voice, "that the danger is not over? If he is left now he will fall asleep, and in all human probability will never wake. You clearly understand that?" "Yes, quite clearly. I promise you he shall not be allowed to fall asleep again." As she spoke she looked at me full in the face for a few moments, and I noticed that her eyes had a perfectly normal appearance, without any trace whatever of a squint. "Very well," I said. "On that understanding I will go now, and I shall hope to find our friend quite recovered at my next visit." I turned to the patient, who was already dozing, and shook his hand heartily. "Good bye, Mr. Graves," I said. "I am sorry to have to disturb your repose so much, but you must keep awake, you know. Won't do to go to sleep." "Very well," he replied drowsily. "Sorry to give you all this trouble. I'll keep awake. But I think you're mistaken. He says it's very important that you shouldn't go to sleep, and that I am to see that you don't. Don't you understand?" "Yes, I understand. But why does the gentleman—" "Now it's of no use for you to ask a lot of questions," Mrs. Schallibaum said playfully. "We'll talk to you to morrow. Good night, doctor. I'll light you down the stairs, but I won't come down with you, or the patient will be falling asleep again." Taking this definite dismissal, I retired, followed by a dreamily surprised glance from the sick man. The housekeeper held the candle over the balusters until I reached the bottom of the stairs, when I perceived through the open door along the passage a glimmer of light from the carriage lamps. The coachman was standing just outside, faintly illuminated by the very dim lamplight, and as I stepped into the carriage he remarked in his Scotch dialect that I "seemed to have been making a night of it." He did not wait for any reply, none being in fact needed, but shut the door and locked it. I lit my little pocket lamp and hung it on the back cushion. I even drew the board and notebook from my pocket. But it seemed rather unnecessary to take a fresh set of notes, and to tell the truth I rather shirked the labour, tired as I was after my late exertions. Besides, I wanted to think over the events of the evening while they were fresh in my memory. Accordingly I put away the notebook, filled and lighted my pipe, and settled myself to review the incidents attending my second visit to this rather uncanny house. Considered in leisurely retrospect, that visit offered quite a number of problems that called for elucidation. There was the patient's condition, for instance. Any doubt as to the cause of his symptoms was set at rest by the effect of the antidotes. Mr. Graves was certainly under the influence of morphine, and the only doubtful question was how he had become so. That he had taken the poison himself was incredible. No morphinomaniac would take such a knock-down dose. It was practically certain that the poison had been administered by someone else, and on Mr. Weiss's own showing there was no one but himself and the housekeeper who could have administered it. And to this conclusion all the other very queer circumstances pointed. What were these circumstances? They were, as I have said, numerous, though many of them seemed trivial. To begin with, Mr. Weiss's habit of appearing some time after my arrival and disappearing some time before my departure was decidedly odd. But still more odd was his sudden departure this evening on what looked like a mere pretext. That departure coincided in time with the sick man's recovery of the power of speech. Could it be that Mr. Weiss was afraid that the half conscious man might say something compromising to him in my presence? It looked rather like it. And yet he had gone away and left me with the patient and the housekeeper. But when I came to think about it, I remembered that Mrs. Schallibaum had shown some anxiety to prevent the patient from talking. She had interrupted him more than once, and had on 2 occasions broken in when he seemed to be about to ask me some question. I was mistaken about something. What was that something that he wanted to tell me? It had struck me as singular that there should be no coffee in the house, but a sufficiency of tea. Germans are not usually tea drinkers, and they do take coffee. But perhaps there was nothing in this. Rather more remarkable was the invisibility of the coachman. Why could he not be sent to fetch the coffee, and why did not he, rather than the housekeeper, come to take the place of Mr. Weiss when the latter had to go away? There were other points too. I recalled the word that sounded like Polen, which Mr. Graves had used in speaking to the housekeeper. Apparently it was a Christian name of some kind. But why did Mr. Graves call the woman by her Christian name when Mr. Weiss addressed her formally as Mrs. Schallibaum? And as to the woman herself, what was the meaning of that curious disappearing squint? Physically it presented no mystery. The woman had an ordinary divergent squint, and like many people who suffer from this displacement, could, by strong muscular effort, bring the eyes temporarily into their normal parallel position. I had detected the displacement when she had tried to maintain the effort too long, and the muscular control had given way. But why had she done it? Was it only feminine vanity, mere sensitiveness respecting a slight personal disfigurement? Might be so, or there might be some further motive. It was impossible to say. Turning the question over, I suddenly remembered the peculiarity of Mr. Weiss's spectacles. And here I met with a real poser. I had certainly seen through those spectacles as clearly as if they had been plain window glass, and they had certainly given an inverted reflection of the candle flame, like that thrown from the surface of a concave lens. Now they obviously could not be both flat and concave, but yet they had the properties peculiar to both flatness and concavity. And there was a further difficulty. If I could see objects unaltered through them, so could Mr. Weiss. But the function of spectacles is to alter the appearances of objects by magnification, reduction, or compensating distortion. If they leave the appearances unchanged, they are useless. I could make nothing of it. After puzzling over it for quite a long time, I had to give it up, which I did, the less unwillingly, inasmuch as the construction of Mr. Weiss's spectacles had no apparent bearing on the case. On arriving home I looked anxiously at the message book, and was relieved to find that there were no further visits to be made. Having made up a mixture for Mr. Graves and handed it to the coachman, I raked the ashes of the surgery fire together and sat down to smoke a final pipe while I reflected once more on the singular and suspicious case in which I had become involved. But fatigue soon put an end to my meditations, and having come to the conclusion that the circumstances demanded a further consultation with Thorndyke, I turned down the gas to a microscopic blue spark and betook myself to bed. End of Chapter 3, Part 2.
Of the Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 4. The Official View. I rose on the following morning still possessed by the determination to make some opportunity during the day to call on Thorndyke and take his advice on the now urgent question as to what I was to do. I use the word urgent advisedly, for the incidents of the preceding evening had left me with firm conviction that poison was being administered for some purpose to my mysterious patient. and that no time must be lost if his life was to be saved. Last night he had escaped only by the narrowest margin, assuming him to be still alive, and it was only my unexpectedly firm attitude that had compelled Mr. Weiss to agree to restorative measures. That I should be sent for again I had not the slightest expectation. If what I so strongly suspected was true, Weiss would call in some other doctor, in the hope of better luck, and it was imperative that he should be stopped before it was too late. This was my view, but I meant to have Thorndyke's opinion and act under his direction. But the best laid plans of mice and men gang aft agley. When I came downstairs and took a preliminary glance at the rough memorandum book, kept by the bottle boy, or, in his absence, by the housemaid, I stood aghast. The morning entries looked already like a sample page of the post office directory. The new calls alone were more than equal to an ordinary day's work, and the routine visits remained to be added. Gloomily wondering whether the Black Death had made a sudden reappearance in England, I hurried to the dining room and made a hasty breakfast, interrupted at intervals by the apparition of the bottle boy to announce new messages. The first 2 or 3 visits solved the mystery. An epidemic of influenza had descended on the neighborhood, and I was getting not only our normal work, but a certain amount of overflow from other practices. Further, it appeared that a strike in the building trade had been followed immediately by a widespread failure of health among the bricklayers who were members of a certain benefit club, which accounted for the remarkable suddenness of the outbreak. Of course, my contemplated visit to Thorndyke was out of the question. I should have to act on my own responsibility. But in the hurry and rush and anxiety of the work, for some of the cases were severe and even critical, I had no opportunity to consider any course of action, nor time to carry it out. Even with the aid of a hansom which I chartered, as Stillbury kept no carriage, I had not finished my last visit until near on midnight, and was then so spent with fatigue that I fell asleep over my postponed supper. As the next day opened with a further increase of work, I sent a telegram to Dr. Stillbury at Hastings, whither he had gone, like a wise man, to recruit after a slight illness. I asked for authority to engage an assistant, but the reply informed me that Stillbury himself was on his way to town, and to my relief, when I dropped in at the surgery for a cup of tea, I found him rubbing his hands over the open day-book. "It's an ill wind that blows nobody good," he remarked cheerfully as we shook hands. "This will pay the expenses of my holiday, including you. By the way, you are not anxious to be off, I suppose?" As a matter of fact, I was, for I had decided to accept Thorndyke's offer, and was now eager to take up my duties with him. But it would have been shabby to leave Stillbury to battle alone with this rush of work, or to seek the services of a strange assistant. "I should like to get off as soon as you can spare me," I replied, "but I'm not going to leave you in the lurch." "That's a good fellow," said Stillbury. "I knew you wouldn't. Let us have some tea and divide up the work. Anything of interest going?" There were 1 or 2 unusual cases on the list, and, as we marked off our respective patients, I gave him the histories in brief synopsis. And then I opened the subject of my mysterious experiences at the house of Mr. Weiss. "There's another affair that I want to tell you about. Rather an unpleasant business." "Oh, dear!" exclaimed Stillbury. He put down his cup and regarded me with quite painful anxiety. "It looks to me like an undoubted case of criminal poisoning," I continued. Stillbury's face cleared instantly. "Oh, I'm glad it's nothing more than that," he said with an air of relief. "I was afraid it was some confounded woman. There's always that danger, you know, when a locum is young and happens, if I may say so, Jervis, to be a good-looking fellow. Let us hear about this case." I gave him a condensed narrative of my connection with the mysterious patient, omitting any reference to Thorndyke, and passing lightly over my efforts to fix the position of the house, and wound up with the remark that the facts ought certainly to be communicated to the police. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly, "I suppose you're right. Deuced unpleasant, though. Police cases don't do a practice any good. They waste a lot of time, too. Keep you hanging about to give evidence. Still, you are quite right. We can't stand by and see the poor devil poisoned without making some effort. But I don't believe the police will do anything in the matter." "Don't you really?" "No, I don't. They like to have things pretty well cut and dried before they act. A prosecution is an expensive affair, so they don't care to prosecute unless they are fairly sure of a conviction. If they fail, they get hauled over the coals." "But you don't think they would get a conviction in this case?" "Not on your evidence, Jervis. They might pick up something fresh, but, if they didn't, they would fail. You haven't got enough hard-baked facts to upset a capable defense. Still, that isn't our affair. You once put the responsibility on the police, and I entirely agree with you." "There ought not to be any delay," said I. "There needn't be. I shall look in on Mrs. Wackford, and you have to see the Rummel children. We shall pass the station on our way. Why shouldn't we drop in and see the inspector or superintendent?" The suggestion met my views exactly. As soon as we had finished tea, we set forth, and in about 10 minutes found ourselves in the bare and forbidding office attached to the station. The presiding officer descended from a high stool, and, carefully laying down his pen, shook hands cordially. "And what can I do for you, gentlemen?" he asked, with an affable smile. Stillbury proceeded to open our business. "My friend here, Dr. Jervis, who has very kindly been looking after my work for a week or two, has had a most remarkable experience, and he wants to tell you about it." "Something in my line of business?" the officer inquired. "That," said I, "is for you to judge. I think it is, but you may think otherwise." And hereupon, and without further preamble, I plunged into the history of the case, giving him a condensed statement similar to that which I had already made to Stillbury. He listened with close attention, jotting down from time to time a brief note on a sheet of paper, and, when I had finished, he wrote out in a black-covered notebook a short précis of my statement. "I have written down here," he said, "the substance of what you have told me. I will read the deposition over to you, and, if it is correct, I will ask you to sign it." He did so, and when I had signed the document, I asked him what was likely to be done in the matter. "I am afraid," he replied, "that we can't take any active measures. You have put us on our guard and we shall keep our eyes open, but I think that is all we can do, unless we hear something further." "But," I exclaimed, "don't you think that this is a very suspicious affair?" "I do," he replied. "A very fishy business indeed, and you were quite right to come and tell us about it." "It seems a pity not to take some measures," I said. "While you are waiting to hear something further, they may give the poor wretch a fresh dose and kill him." "In which case we should hear something further, unless some fool of a doctor were to give him a death certificate." "But that is very unsatisfactory. The man ought not to be allowed to die." "I quite agree with you, sir, but we've no evidence that he is going to die. His friends sent for you, and you treated him skilfully and left him in a fair way to recover. That's all we really know about it." "Yes, I know," the officer continued as I made signs of disagreement. "You think that a crime is possibly going to be committed and that we ought to prevent it. But you overrate our powers. We can only act on evidence that a crime has actually been committed or is actually being attempted. Now we have no such evidence. Look at your statement, and tell me what you can swear to." "I think I could swear that Mr. Graves has taken a poisonous dose of morphine." "And who gave him that poisonous dose?" "I very strongly suspect—" "That's no good, sir," interrupted the officer. "Suspicion isn't evidence. We should want you to swear an information and give us enough facts to make out a prima facie case against some definite person, and you couldn't do it. Your information amounts to this, that a certain person has taken a poisonous dose of morphine and apparently recovered. That's all. You can't swear that the names given to you are real names, and you can't give us any address or even any locality." "I took some compass bearings in the carriage," I said. "You could locate the house, I think, without much difficulty." The officer smiled faintly and fixed an abstracted gaze on the clock. "You could, sir," he replied. "I have no doubt whatever that you could. I couldn't. But in any case we haven't enough to go upon. If you learn anything fresh, I hope you will let me know, and I am very much obliged to you for taking so much trouble in the matter. Good evening, sir." "Good evening, Dr. Stillbury." He shook hands with us both genially, and, accepting perforce this very polite but unmistakable dismissal, we took our departure. Outside the station, Stillbury heaved a comfortable sigh. He was evidently relieved to find that no upheavals were to take place in his domain. "I thought that would be their attitude," he said, "and they are quite right, you know. The function of the law is to prevent crime, it is true, but prophylaxis in the sense in which we understand it is not possible in legal practice." I assented without enthusiasm. It was disappointing to find that no precautionary measures were to be taken. However, I had done all that I could in the matter. No further responsibility lay upon me, and as it was practically certain that I had seen and heard the last of Mr. Graves and his mysterious household, I dismissed the case from my mind. At the next corner, Stillbury and I parted to go our respective ways, and my attention was soon transferred from the romance of crime to the realities of epidemic influenza. The plethora of work in Dr. Stillbury's practice continued longer than I had bargained for. Day after day went by and still found me tramping the dingy streets of Kennington or scrambling up and down narrow stairways, turning in at night dead tired, or turning out half awake to the hideous jangle of the night bell. It was very provoking. For months I had resisted Thorndyke's persuasion to give up general practice and join him, not from a lack of inclination, but from a deep suspicion that he was thinking of my wants rather than his own, that his was a charitable rather than a business proposal. Now that I knew this not to be the case, I was impatient to join him, and as I trudged through the dreary thoroughfares of the superannuated suburb, with its once rustic villas and its faded gardens, my thoughts would turn enviously to the quiet dignity of the Temple and my friend's chambers in King's Bench Walk. The closed carriage appeared no more, nor did any whisper either of good or evil reach me in connection with the mysterious house from which it had come. Mr. Graves had apparently gone out of my life forever. But if he had gone out of my life, he had not gone out of my memory. Often, as I walked my rounds, would the picture of that dimly lit room rise unbidden. Often I would find myself looking once more into that ghastly face, so worn, so wasted and haggard, and yet so far from repellent. All the incidents of that last night would reconstitute themselves with a vividness that showed the intensity of the impression they had made at the time. I would have gladly forgotten the whole affair, for every incident of it was fraught with discomfort, but it clung to my memory, it haunted me, and ever as it returned it bore with it the disquieting questions. Was Mr. Graves still alive? And, if he was not, was there really nothing which could have been done to save him? Nearly a month passed before the practice began to show signs of returning to its normal condition. Then the daily list became more and more contracted and the day's work proportionally shorter, and thus the term of my servitude came to an end. One evening, as we were writing up the day book, Stillbury remarked, "I almost think, Jervis, I could manage by myself now. I know you are only staying for my sake." "I am staying to finish my engagement, but I shan't be sorry to clear out if you can do without me." "I think I can. When would you like to be off?" "As soon as possible. Say tomorrow morning, after I have made a few visits and transferred the patients to you." "Very well," said Stillbury. "Then I will give you your cheque and settle up everything tonight, so that you shall be free to go off when you like tomorrow morning." Thus ended my connection with Kennington Lane. On the following day, at about noon, I found myself strolling across Waterloo Bridge with the sensations of a newly liberated convict and a cheque for 25 guineas in my pocket. My luggage was to follow when I sent for it. Now, unhampered even by a handbag, I joyfully descended the steps at the north end of the bridge and headed for King's Bench Walk by way of the Embankment and Middle Temple Lane. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Chelsea Baker.
Chapter 5 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Seidel. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 5. Geoffrey Blackmore's Will. My arrival at Thorndyke's chambers was not unexpected, having been heralded by a premonitory postcard. The oak was open, and an application of the little brass knocker of the inner door immediately introduced my colleague himself and a very hearty welcome. "At last," said Thorndyke, "you have come forth from the house of bondage. I began to think that you had taken up your abode in Kennington for good." "I was beginning myself to wonder when I should escape, but here I am, and I may say at once that I am ready to shake the dust of general practice off my feet forever. That is, if you are still willing to have me as your assistant." "Willing!" exclaimed Thorndyke. "Barkis himself was not more willing than I. You will be invaluable to me. Let us settle the terms of our comradeship forthwith, and tomorrow we will take measures to enter you as a student of the Inner Temple. Shall we have our talk in the open air in the spring sunshine?" I agreed readily to his proposal, for it was a bright, sunny day, and warm for the time of year, the beginning of April. We descended to the walk, and thence slowly made our way to the quiet court behind the church, where poor old Oliver Goldsmith lies, as he would surely have wished to lie, in the midst of all that had been dear to him in his checkered life. I need not record the matter of our conversation. To Thorndyke's proposals I had no objections to offer but my own unworthiness and his excessive liberality. A few minutes saw our covenants fully agreed upon, and when Thorndyke had noted the points on a slip of paper, signed and dated it, and handed it to me. The business was at an end. "There," my colleague said with a smile as he put away his pocket-book. "If people would only settle their affairs in that way, a good part of the occupation of lawyers would be gone. Brevity is the soul of wit, and the fear of simplicity is the beginning of litigation." "And now," I said, "I propose that we go and feed. I will invite you to lunch to celebrate our contract." "My learned junior is premature," he replied. "I had already arranged a little festivity, or rather had modified one that was already arranged. You remember Mr. Marchmont, the solicitor?" "Yes." "He called this morning to ask me to lunch with him and with a new client at the Cheshire Cheese. I accepted and notified him that I should bring you." "Why the Cheshire Cheese?" I asked. "Why not? Marchmont's reasons for the selection were, first, that his client has never seen an old-fashioned London tavern, and second, that this is Wednesday and he, Marchmont, has a gluttonous affection for a really fine beefsteak pudding. You don't object, I hope?" "Oh, not at all. In fact, now that you mention it, my own sensations incline me to sympathize with Marchmont. I breakfasted rather early." "Then come," said Thorndyke. "The assignation is for 1 o'clock, and, if we walk slowly, we shall just hit it off." We sauntered up Inner Temple Lane, and crossing Fleet Street, headed sedately for the tavern. As we entered the quaint, old-world dining-room, Thorndyke looked round, and a gentleman who was seated with a companion at a table in one of the little boxes or compartments rose and saluted us. "Let me introduce you to my friend, Mr. Stephen Blackmore," he said as we approached. Then, turning to his companion, he introduced us by our respective names. "I engaged this box," he continued, "so that we might be private if we wished to have a little preliminary chat. Not that beefsteak pudding is a great help to conversation, but when people have a certain business in view, their talk is sure to drift towards it, sooner or later." Thorndyke and I sat down opposite the lawyer and his client, and we mutually inspected one another. Marchmont I already knew, an elderly, professional-looking man, a typical solicitor of the old school, fresh-faced, precise, rather irascible, and conveying a not unpleasant impression of taking a reasonable interest in his diet. The other man was quite young, not more than 25, and was a fine, athletic-looking fellow with a healthy, out-of-door complexion and an intelligent and highly prepossessing face. I took a liking to him at the first glance, and so, I saw, did Thorndyke. "You two gentlemen," said Blackmore, addressing us, "seem to be quite old acquaintances. I have heard so much about you from my friend, Reuben Hornby." "Ah!" exclaimed Marchmont. "That was a queer case. The case of the red thumb mark, as the papers called it. It was an eye-opener to old-fashioned lawyers like myself. We've had scientific witnesses before, and bullied 'em properly, by Jove, when they wouldn't give us the evidence that we wanted. But the scientific lawyer is something new. His appearance in court made us all sit up, I can assure you." "I hope we shall make you sit up again," said Thorndyke. "You won't this time," said Marchmont. "The issues in this case of my friend Blackmore's are purely legal, or rather, there are no issues at all. There is nothing in dispute. I tried to prevent Blackmore from consulting you, but he wouldn't listen to reason. Here, waiter! How much longer are we to be waiters? We shall die of old age before we get our victuals." The waiter smiled apologetically. "Yes, sir," said he. "Coming now, sir." And at this very moment there was borne into the room a gargantuan pudding in a great bucket of a basin, which, being placed on a three-legged stool, was forthwith attacked ferociously by the white-clothed, white-capped carver. We watched the process, as did every one present, with an interest not entirely gluttonous, for it added a pleasant touch to the picturesque old room, with its sanded floor, its homely pew-like boxes, its high-backed settles, and the friendly portrait of the great lexicographer that beamed down on us from the wall. "This is a very different affair from your great, glittering modern restaurant," Mr. Marchmont remarked. "It is indeed," said Blackmore, "and if this is the way in which our ancestors lived, it would seem that they had a better idea of comfort than we have." There was a short pause, during which Mr. Marchmont glared hungrily at the pudding. Then Thorndyke said, "So you refuse to listen to reason, Mr. Blackmore?" "Yes. You see, Mr. Marchmont and his partner had gone into the matter and decided that there was nothing to be done. Then I happened to mention the affair to Reuben Hornby, and he urged me to ask your advice on the case." "Like his impudence," growled Marchmont, "to meddle with my client." "On which," continued Blackmore, "I spoke to Mr. Marchmont, and he agreed that it was worth while to take your opinion on the case, though he warned me to cherish no hopes, as the affair was not really within your specialty." "So you understand," said Marchmont, "that we expect nothing. This is quite a forlorn hope. We are taking your opinion as a mere formality, to be able to say that we have left nothing untried." "That is an encouraging start," Thorndyke remarked. "It leaves me unembarrassed by the possibility of failure. But meanwhile you are arousing in me a devouring curiosity as to the nature of the case. Is it highly confidential? Because if not, I would mention that Jervis has now joined me as my permanent colleague." "It isn't confidential at all," said Marchmont. "The public are in full possession of the facts, and we should be only too happy to put them in still fuller possession, through the medium of the probate court, if we could find a reasonable pretext. But we can't." Here the waiter charged our table with the fussy rapidity of the overdue. "Sorry to keep you waiting, sir. Rather early, sir. Wouldn't like it underdone, sir." Marchmont inspected his plate critically and remarked, "I sometimes suspect these oysters of being mussels, and I'll swear the larks are sparrows." "Let us hope so," said Thorndyke. "The lark is better employed at Heaven's gate singing than garnishing a beefsteak pudding. But you were telling us about your case." "So I was. Well, it's just a matter of Ale or claret? Oh, claret, I know. You despise the good old British John Barleycorn." "He that drinks beer," reported Thorndyke. "But you were saying that it's just a matter of a perverse testator and an ill-drawn will. A particularly irritating case, too, because the defective will replaces a perfectly sound one, and the intentions of the testator were excellent ale, this. A little heady, perhaps, but sound. Better than your sour French wine, Thorndyke. Were quite obvious. What he evidently desired was mustard. Better have some mustard. No? Well, well, even a Frenchman would take mustard. You can have no appreciation of flavour, Thorndyke, if you take your victuals in that crude, unseasoned state. And, talking of flavour, do you suppose that there is really any difference between that of a lark and that of a sparrow?" Thorndyke smiled grimly. "I should suppose," said he, "that they were indistinguishable. But the question could easily be put to the test of experiment." "That is true," agreed Marchmont, "and it would really be worth trying, for, as you say, sparrows are more easily obtainable than larks. But about this will, I was saying now what was I saying?" "I understood you to say," replied Thorndyke, "that the intentions of the testator were in some way connected with mustard. Isn't that so, Jervis?" "That was what I gathered," said I. Marchmont gazed at us for a moment with a surprised expression, and then, laughing good humouredly, fortified himself with a draught of ale. "The moral of which is," Thorndyke added, "that testamentary dispositions should not be mixed up with beef steak pudding." "I believe you're right, Thorndyke," said the unabashed solicitor. "Business is business and eating is eating. We had better talk over our case in my office or your chambers after lunch." "Yes," said Thorndyke. "Come over to the Temple with me, and I will give you a cup of coffee to clear your brain. Are there any documents?" "I have all the papers here in my bag," replied Marchmont, "and the conversation, such conversation as possible when beards wag all over the festive board, drifted into other channels. As soon as the meal was finished and the reckoning paid, we trooped out of Wine Office Court, and insinuating ourselves through the line of empty hansoms that, in those days, crawled in a continuous procession on either side of Fleet Street, betook ourselves by way of Mitre Court to King's Bench Walk. There, when the coffee had been requisitioned and our chairs drawn up around the fire, Mr. Marchmont unloaded from his bag a portentous bundle of papers, and we addressed ourselves to the business in hand. "Now," said Marchmont, "let me repeat what I said before. Legally speaking, we have no case, not the ghost of one. But my client wished to take your opinion, and I agreed on the bare chance that you might detect some point that we had overlooked. I don't think you will, for we have gone into the case very thoroughly, but still, there is the infinitesimal chance, and we may as well take it. Would you like to read the two wills, or shall I first explain the circumstances?" "I think," replied Thorndyke, "a narrative of the events in the order of their occurrence would be most helpful. I should like to know as much as possible about the testator before I examine the documents." "Very well," said Marchmont. "Then I will begin with a recital of the circumstances, which, briefly stated, are these. My client, Stephen Blackmore, is the son of Mr. Edward Blackmore, deceased. Edward Blackmore had two brothers who survived him, John the elder and Geoffrey the younger. Geoffrey is the testator in this case. Some 2 years ago, Geoffrey Blackmore executed a will by which he made his nephew Stephen his executor and sole legatee, and a few months later he added a codicil, giving £250 to his brother John." "What was the value of the estate?" Thorndyke asked. "About £3,500, all invested in consols. The testator had a pension from the Foreign Office on which he lived, leaving his capital untouched. Soon after having made his will, he left the rooms in Jermyn Street, where he had lived for some years, stored his furniture, and went to Florence. From thence he moved on to Rome, and then to Venice and other places in Italy, and so continued to travel about until the end of last September, when it appears that he returned to England, for at the beginning of October he took a set of chambers at New Inn, which he furnished with some of the things from his old rooms. As far as we can make out, he never communicated with any of his friends excepting his brother, and the fact of his being in residence at New Inn, or of his being in England at all, became known to them only when he died." "Was this quite in accordance with his ordinary habits?" Thorndyke asked. "I should say not quite," Blackmore answered. "My uncle was a studious, solitary man, but he was not formerly a recluse. He was not much of a correspondent, but he kept up some sort of communication with his friends. He used, for instance, to write to me sometimes, and when I came down from Cambridge for the vacations, he had me stay with him at his rooms." "Is there anything known that accounts for the change in his habits?" "Yes, there is," replied Marchmont. "We shall come to that presently. To proceed with the narrative, on the 15th of last March he was found dead in his chambers, and a more recent will was then discovered, dated the 12th of November of last year. Now, no change had taken place in the circumstances of the testator to account for the new will, nor was there any appreciable alteration in the disposition of the property. As far as we can make out, the new will was drawn with the idea of stating the intentions of the testator with greater exactness, and for the sake of doing away with the codicil. The entire property, with the exception of £250, was, as before, bequeathed to Stephen, but the separate items were specified, and the testator's brother, John Blackmore, was named as the executor and residuary legatee." "I see," said Thorndyke. "So that your client's interest in the will would appear to be practically unaffected by the change?" "Yes, there it is," exclaimed the lawyer, slapping the table to add emphasis to his words. "That is the pity of it. If people who have no knowledge of the law would only refrain from tinkering with their wills, what a world of trouble would be saved." "Oh, come," said Thorndyke, "it's not for a lawyer to say that." "No, I suppose not," Marchmont agreed. "Only, you see, we like the muddle to be made by the other side. But in this case the muddle is on our side. The change, as you say, seems to leave our friend Stephen's interests unaffected. That is, of course, what poor Geoffrey Blackmore thought. But he was mistaken. The effect of the change is absolutely disastrous." "Indeed!" "Yes. As I have said, no alteration in the testator's circumstances had taken place at the time the new will was executed. But only 2 days before his death his sister, Mrs. Edmund Wilson, died, and on her will being proved, it appeared that she had bequeathed to him her entire personalty, estimated at about £30,000. "Hi ho!" exclaimed Thorndyke. "What an unfortunate affair!" "You are right," said Mr. Marchmont. "It was a disaster. By the original will this great sum would have accrued to our friend Mr. Stephen, whereas now, of course, it goes to the residuary legatee, Mr. John Blackmore. And what makes it even more exasperating is the fact that this is obviously not in accordance with the wishes and intentions of Mr. Geoffrey, who clearly desired his nephew to inherit his property." "Yes," said Thorndyke, "I think you are justified in assuming that. But do you know whether Mr. Geoffrey was aware of his sister's intentions?" "We think not. Her will was executed as recently as the 3rd of September last, and it seems that there had been no communication between her and Mr. Geoffrey since that date. Besides, if you consider Mr. Geoffrey's actions, you will see that they suggest no knowledge or expectation of this very important bequest. A man does not make elaborate dispositions in regard to £3,000 and then leave a sum of £30,000 to be disposed of casually as the residue of the estate." "No," Thorndyke agreed. "And as you have said, the manifest intention of the testator was to leave the bulk of his property to Mr. Stephen. So we may take it as virtually certain that Mr. Geoffrey had no knowledge of the fact that he was a beneficiary under his sister's will." "Yes," said Mr. Marchmont, "I think we may take that as nearly certain." "With reference to the second will," said Thorndyke, "I suppose there is no need to ask whether the document itself has been examined. I mean, as to its being a genuine document and perfectly regular." Mr. Marchmont shook his head sadly. "No," he said, "I am sorry to say that there can be no possible doubt as to the authenticity and regularity of the document. The circumstances under which it was executed establish its genuineness beyond any question." "What were those circumstances?" Thorndyke asked. "They were these. On the morning of the 12th of November last, Mr. Geoffrey came to the porter's lodge with a document in his hand. 'This,' he said, 'is my will. I want you to witness my signature. Would you mind doing so, and can you find another respectable person to ask as a second witness?' Now it happened that a nephew of the porter's, a painter by trade, was at work at the inn. The porter went out and fetched him into the lodge, and the two men agreed to witness the signature. 'You had better read the will,' said Mr. Geoffrey. 'It is not actually necessary, but it is an additional safeguard, and there is nothing of a private nature in the document.' The two men accordingly read the document, and, when Mr. Geoffrey had signed it in their presence, they affixed their signatures. And I may add that the painter left the recognizable impressions of 3 greasy fingers." "And the witnesses have been examined?" "Yes, they have both sworn to the document and to their own signatures, and the painter recognized his finger marks." "That," said Thorndyke, "seems to dispose pretty effectually of any question as to the genuineness of the will. And if, as I gather, Mr. Geoffrey came to the lodge alone, the question of undue influence is disposed of too." "Yes," said Mr. Marchmont, "I think we must pass the will as absolutely flawless." "It strikes me as rather odd," said Thorndyke, "that Geoffrey should have known so little about his sister's intentions. Can you explain it, Mr. Blackmore?" "I don't think that it's very remarkable," Stephen replied. "I knew very little of my aunt's affairs, and I don't think my Uncle Geoffrey knew much more, for he was under the impression that she had only a life interest in her husband's property. And he may have been right. It is not clear what money this was that she left to my uncle. She was a very taciturn woman, and made few confidences to anyone." "So it is possible," said Thorndyke, "that she herself may have acquired this money recently by some bequest?" "It is quite possible," Stephen answered. "She died, I understand," said Thorndyke, glancing at the notes that he had jotted down, "2 days before Mr. Geoffrey. What date would that be?" "Geoffrey died on the 14th of March," said Marchmont. "So that Mrs. Wilson died on the 12th of March." "That is so," Marchmont replied. And Thorndyke then asked, "Did she die suddenly?" "No," replied Stephen. "She died of cancer. I understand that it was cancer of the stomach." "Do you happen to know," Thorndyke asked, "what sort of relations existed between Geoffrey and his brother John?" "At one time," said Stephen, "I know they were not very cordial, but the breach may have been made up later, though I don't know what it actually was." "I ask the question," said Thorndyke, "because, as I dare say you have noticed, there is, in the first will, some hint of improved relations. As it was originally drawn, that will makes Mr. Stephen the sole legatee. Then, a little later, a codicil is added in favour of John, showing that Geoffrey had felt the necessity of making some recognition of his brother. This seems to point to some change in the relations, and the question arises, if such a change did actually occur, was it the beginning of a new and further improving state of feeling between the two brothers? Have you any facts bearing on that question?" Marchmont pursed up his lips with the air of a man considering an unwelcome suggestion, and after a few moments of reflection answered, "I think we must say yes to that. There is the undeniable fact that, of all Geoffrey's friends, John Blackmore was the only one who knew that he was living in New Inn." "Oh, John knew that, did he?" "Yes, he certainly did, for it came out in the evidence that he had called on Geoffrey at his chambers more than once. There is no denying that. But, mark you," Mr. Marchmont added emphatically, "that does not cover the inconsistency of the will. There is nothing in the second will to suggest that Geoffrey intended to materially increase the bequest to his brother." "I quite agree with you, Marchmont. I think that is a perfectly sound position. You have, I suppose, fully considered the question as to whether it would be possible to set aside the second will on the ground that it fails to carry out the evident wishes and intentions of the testator?" "Yes. My partner, Winwood, and I went into that question very carefully. And we also took counsel's opinion, Sir Horace Barnaby, and he was of the same opinion as ourselves, that the court would certainly uphold the will." "I think that would be my own view," said Thorndyke, "especially after what you have told me. Do I understand that John Blackmore was the only person who knew that Geoffrey was in residence at New Inn?" "The only one of his private friends. His bankers knew, and so did the officials from whom he drew his pension." "Of course, he would have to notify his bankers of his change of address." "Yes, of course. And à propos of the bank, I may mention that the manager tells me that, of late, they had noticed a slight change in the character of Geoffrey's signature. I think you will see the reason of the change when you hear the rest of the story. It was very trifling, not more than commonly occurs when a man begins to grow old, especially if there is some failure of eyesight." "Was Mr. Geoffrey's eyesight failing?" asked Thorndyke. "Yes, it was, undoubtedly," said Stephen. "He was practically blind in one eye, and in the very last letter that I ever had from him he mentioned that there were signs of commencing cataract in the other." "You spoke of his pension. He continued to draw that regularly?" "Yes, he drew his allowance every month, or rather, his bankers drew it for him. They had been accustomed to do so when he was abroad, and the authorities seem to have allowed the practice to continue." Thorndyke reflected a while, running his eye over the notes on the slips of paper in his hand, and Marchmont surveyed him with a malicious smile. Presently the latter remarked, "Methinks the learned counsel is floored." Thorndyke laughed. "It seems to me," he retorted, "that your proceedings are rather like those of the amiable individual who offered the bear a flint pebble, that he might crack it and extract the kernel. Your confounded will seems to offer no soft spot on which one could commence an attack. But we won't give up. We seem to have sucked the will dry. Let us now have a few facts reflecting the parties concerned in it, and, as Jeffrey is the central figure, let us begin with him and the tragedy at New Inn that formed the starting point of all this trouble." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Seidel. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 6. Jeffrey Blackmore, deceased. Having made the above proposition, Thorndyke placed a fresh slip of paper on the blotting pad on his knee and looked inquiringly at Mr. Marchmont, who in turn sighed and looked at the bundle of documents on the table. "What do you want to know?" he asked, a little wearily. "Everything," replied Thorndyke. "You have hinted at circumstances that would account for a change in Jeffrey's habits, and that would explain an alteration in the character of his signature. Let us have those circumstances, and, if I might venture on a suggestion, it would be that we take the events in the order in which they occurred, or in which they became known." "That's the worst of you, Thorndyke," Marchmont grumbled. "When a case has been squeezed out to the last drop, in a legal sense, you want to begin all over again with a family history of every one concerned, and a list of his effects and household furniture. But I suppose you will have to be humoured, and I imagine that the best way in which to give you the information you want will be to recite the circumstances surrounding the death of Jeffrey Blackmore. Will that suit you?" "Perfectly," replied Thorndyke, and thereupon Marchmont began. The death of Jeffrey Blackmore was discovered at about 11 o'clock in the morning of the 15th of March. It seems that a builder's man was ascending a ladder to examine a gutter on No. 31, New Inn, when, on passing a second-floor window that was opened at the top, he looked in and perceived a gentleman lying on a bed. The gentleman was fully clothed and had apparently lain down on the bed to rest. At least, so the builder thought at the time, for he was merely passing the window on his way up and, very properly, did not make a minute examination. But when, some 10 minutes later, he came down and saw that the gentleman was still in the same position, he looked at him more attentively, and this is what he noticed, but perhaps we had better have it in his own words as he told the story at the inquest. "When I came to look at the gentleman a bit more closely, it struck me that he looked rather queer. His face looked very white, or rather pale yellow, like parchment, and his mouth was open. He did not seem to be breathing. On the bed by his side was a brass object of some kind, I could not make out what it was, and he seemed to be holding some small metal object in his hand. I thought it a rather queer affair, so when I came down I went across to the lodge and told the porter about it. The porter came out across the square with me, and I showed him the window. Then he told me to go up the stairs to Mr. Blackmore's chambers on the second pair, and knock and keep on knocking until I got an answer. I went up, and I knocked and I kept on knocking as loud as I could, but, though I fetched everybody out of all the other chambers in the house, I couldn't get any answer from Mr. Blackmore. So I went downstairs again, and then Mr. Walker, the porter, sent me for a policeman." I went out and met a policeman just by Dane's Inn and told him about the affair, and he came back with me. He and the porter consulted together, and then they told me to go up the ladder and get in at the window and open the door of the chambers from the inside. So I went up, and as soon as I got in at the window I saw that the gentleman was dead. I went through the other room and opened the outer door and let in the porter and the policeman." "That," said Mr. Marchmont, laying down the paper containing the depositions, "is the way in which poor Geoffrey Blackmore's death came to be discovered." The constable reported to his inspector, and the inspector sent for the divisional surgeon, whom he accompanied to New Inn. I need not go into the evidence given by the police officers, as the surgeon saw all that they saw, and his statement covers everything that is known about Geoffrey's death. This is what he says, after describing how he was sent for and arrived at the inn. "In the bedroom I found the body of a man between 50 and 60 years of age, which has since been identified in my presence as that of Mr. Geoffrey Blackmore. It was fully dressed, and wore boots on which was a moderate amount of dry mud. It was lying on its back on the bed, which did not appear to have been slept in, and showed no signs of any struggle or disturbance. The right hand loosely grasped a hypodermic syringe containing a few drops of a clear liquid, which I have since analyzed and found to be a concentrated solution of strophanthin. On the bed, close to the left side of the body, was a brass opium pipe of a pattern which I believe is made in China. The bowl of the pipe contained a small quantity of charcoal, and a fragment of opium together with some ash, and there was on the bed a little ash which appeared to have dropped from the bowl when the pipe fell or was laid down. On the mantel-shelf in the bedroom I found a small glass stopper jar containing about an ounce of solid opium, and another larger jar containing wood charcoal broken up into small fragments. Also a bowl containing a quantity of ash with fragments of half-burned charcoal and a few minute particles of charred opium. By the side of the bowl were a knife, a kind of awl or pricker, and a very small pair of tongs, which I believe to have been used for carrying a piece of lighted charcoal to the pipe. On the dressing table were two glass tubes labeled hypodermic tabloids, strophanthin 1/500th grain, and a minute glass mortar and pestle, of which the former contained a few crystals which have since been analyzed by me and found to be strophanthin. On examining the body I found that it had been dead about 12 hours. There were no marks of violence or any abnormal condition excepting a single puncture in the right thigh, apparently made by the needle of the hypodermic syringe. The puncture was deep and vertical in direction, as if the needle had been driven in through the clothing. I made a post-mortem examination of the body and found that death was due to poisoning by strophanthin, which appeared to have been injected into the thigh. The two tubes which I found on the dressing table would each have contained, if full, 20 tabloids, each tabloid representing 1/500th of a grain of strophanthin. Assuming that the whole of this quantity was injected, the amount taken would be 40/500ths, or about 1/12th of a grain. The ordinary medicinal dose of strophanthin is 1/500th of a grain. I also found in the body appreciable traces of morphine, the principal alkaloid of opium, from which I infer that the deceased was a confirmed opium smoker. This inference was supported by the general condition of the body, which was ill-nourished and emaciated and presented all the appearances usually met with in the bodies of persons addicted to the habitual use of opium. That is the evidence of the surgeon. He was recalled later, as we shall see, but meanwhile I think you will agree with me that the facts testified to by him fully account not only for the change in Geoffrey's habits, his solitary and secretive mode of life, but also for the alteration in his handwriting. "Yes," agreed Thorndyke, "that seems to be so. By the way, what did the change in the handwriting amount to?" "Very little," replied Marchmont. "It was hardly perceptible. just a slight loss of firmness and distinctness, such a trifling change as you would expect to find in the handwriting of a man who had taken to drink or drugs, or anything that might impair the steadiness of his hand. I should not have noticed it myself, but of course the people at the bank are experts, constantly scrutinizing signatures, and scrutinizing them with a very critical eye. "Is there any other evidence that bears on this case?" Thorndyke asked. Marchmont turned over the bundle of papers and smiled grimly. "My dear Thorndyke," he said, "none of this evidence has the slightest bearing on the case. It is all perfectly irrelevant as far as the will is concerned. But I know your little peculiarities, and I am indulging you, as you see, to the top of your bent. The next evidence is that of the chief porter, a very worthy and intelligent man named Walker. This is what he says, after the usual preliminaries. I have viewed the body which forms the subject of this inquiry. It is that of Mr. Geoffrey Blackmore, the tenant of a set of chambers on the second floor of No. 31, New Inn. I have known the deceased nearly 6 months, and during that time have seen and conversed with him frequently. He took the chambers on the 2nd of last October, and came into residence at once. Tenants at New Inn have to furnish 2 references. The references that the deceased gave were his bankers and his brother, Mr. John Blackmore. I may say that the deceased was very well known to me. He was a quiet, pleasant-mannered gentleman, and it was his habit to drop in occasionally at the lodge and have a chat with me. I went into his chambers with him once or twice on some small matters of business, and I noted that there were always a number of books and papers on the table. I understand from him that he spent most of his time indoors, engaged in study and writing. I know very little about his way of living. He had no laundress to look after his rooms, so I suppose he did his own housework and cooking. But he told me that he took most of his meals outside, at restaurants or his club. Deceased impressed me as a rather melancholy, low-spirited gentleman. He was very much troubled about his eyesight, and mentioned the matter to me on several occasions. He told me that he was practically blind in one eye, and that the sight of the other was rapidly failing. He said that this afflicted him greatly, because his only pleasure in life was in the reading of books, and that if he could not read he should not wish to live. On another occasion he said that, to a blind man, life was not worth having. On the 12th of last November he came to the lodge with a paper in his hand, which he said was his will. But I needn't read that," said Marchmont, turning over the leaf. "I've told you how the will was signed and witnessed. We will pass on to the day of poor Geoffrey's death. On the 14th of March, the porter says, at about 6:30 in the evening, the deceased came to the inn in a 4-wheeled cab. That was the day of the great fog. I do not know if there was anything in the cab with the deceased, but I think not, because he came to the lodge just before 8 o'clock and had a little talk with me. He said that he had been overtaken by the fog and could not see at all. He was quite blind, and had been obliged to ask a stranger to call a cab for him, as he could not find his way through the streets. He then gave me a cheque for the rent. I reminded him that the rent was not due until the 25th, but he said he wished to pay it now. He also gave me some money to pay 1 or 2 small bills that were owing to some of the tradespeople, a milkman, a baker, and a stationer. This struck me as very strange, because he had always managed his business and paid the tradespeople himself. He told me that the fog had irritated his eyes so that he could hardly read, and he was afraid he should soon be quite blind. He was very depressed, so much so that I felt quite uneasy about him. When he left the lodge, he went back across the square as if returning to his chambers. There was then no gate open excepting the main gate where the lodge is situated. That was the last time that I saw the deceased alive." Mr. Marchmont laid the paper on the table. "That is the porter's evidence. The remaining depositions are those of Noble, the night porter, John Blackmore, and our friend here, Mr. Stephen." The night porter had not much to tell. This is the substance of his evidence: "I have viewed the body of the deceased and identify it as that of Mr. Geoffrey Blackmore. I knew the deceased well by sight, and occasionally had a few words with him. I know nothing of his habits excepting that he used to sit up rather late. It is one of my duties to go around the inn at night and call out the hours until 1 o'clock in the morning. When calling out 1 o'clock, I often saw a light in the sitting room of the deceased's chambers. On the night of the 14th instant, the light was burning until past 1 o'clock, but it was in the bedroom. The light in the sitting room was out by 10 o'clock." We now come to John Blackmore's evidence. He says: "I have viewed the body of the deceased and recognize it as that of my brother Geoffrey. I last saw him alive on the 23rd of February, when I called at his chambers. He then seemed in a very despondent state of mind, and told me that his eyesight was fast failing. I was aware that he occasionally smoked opium, but I did not know that it was a confirmed habit. I urged him, on several occasions, to abandon the practice. I have no reason to believe that his affairs were in any way embarrassed, or that he had any reason for making away with himself other than failing eyesight. But, having regard to his state of mind when I last saw him, I am not surprised at what has happened." That is the substance of John Blackmore's evidence, and as to Mr. Stephen, his statement merely sets forth the fact that he has identified the body as that of his Uncle Geoffrey. And now I think you have all the facts. Is there anything more that you want to ask me before I go, for I really must run away now?" "I should like," said Thorndyke, "to know a little more about the parties concerned in this affair, but perhaps Mr. Stephen can give me the information." "I expect he can," said Marchmont. "At any rate, he knows more about them than I do, so I will be off. If you happen to think of any way," he concluded with a sly smile, "of upsetting that will, just let me know, and I will lose no time in entering a caveat. Good bye. Don't trouble to let me out." As soon as he was gone, Thorndyke turned to Stephen Blackmore. "I am going," he said, "to ask you a few questions which may appear rather trifling, but you must remember that my methods of inquiry concern themselves with persons and things rather than with documents. For instance, I have not gathered very completely what sort of person your Uncle Geoffrey was. Could you tell me a little more about him?" "What shall I tell you?" Stephen asked, with a slightly embarrassed air. "Well, begin with his personal appearance." "That is rather difficult to describe," said Stephen. "He was a medium-sized man and about 5 feet 7, fair, slightly grey, clean-shaved, rather spare and slight, had grey eyes, wore spectacles, and stooped a little as he walked. He was quiet and gentle in manner, rather yielding and irresolute in character, and his health was not at all robust, though he had no infirmity or disease excepting his bad eyesight. His age was about 55. "How came he to be a Civil Service pensioner at 55?" asked Thorndyke. "Oh, that was through an accident. He had a nasty fall from a horse, and, being a rather nervous man, the shock was very severe. For some time after he was a complete wreck. But the failure of his eyesight was the actual cause of his retirement. It seems that the fall damaged his eyes in some way. In fact, he practically lost the sight of one, the right, from that moment, and as that had been his good eye, the accident left his vision very much impaired, so that he was at first given sick leave and then allowed to retire on a pension." Thorndyke noted these particulars and then said: "Your uncle has been more than once referred to as a man of studious habits. Does that mean that he pursued any particular branch of learning?" "Yes. He was an enthusiastic Oriental scholar. His official duties had taken him at one time to Yokohama and Tokio, and at another to Baghdad, and while at those places he gave a good deal of attention to the languages, literatures, and arts of the countries. He was also greatly interested in Babylonian and Assyrian archaeology, and I believe he assisted for some time in the excavation at Birs Nimrud." "Indeed," said Thorndyke. "This is very interesting. I had no idea that he was a man of such considerable attainments. The facts mentioned by Mr. Marchmont would hardly have led one to think of him as what he seems to have been, a scholar of some distinction." "I don't know that Mr. Marchmont realized the fact himself," said Stephen, "or that he would have considered it of any moment if he had. Nor, as far as that goes, do I. But of course I have no experience of legal matters." "You can never tell beforehand," said Thorndyke, "what facts may turn out to be of moment, so that it is best to collect all you can get. By the way, were you aware that your uncle was an opium smoker?" "No, I was not. I knew that he had an opium pipe, which he brought with him when he came home from Japan, but I thought it was only a curio. I remember him telling me that he once tried a few puffs at an opium pipe and found it rather pleasant, though it gave him a headache. But I had no idea he had contracted the habit. In fact, I may say that I was utterly astonished when the fact came out at the inquest." Thorndyke made a note of this answer, too, and said, "I think that is all I have to ask you about your Uncle Geoffrey. And now, as to Mr. John Blackmore, what sort of a man is he?" "I am afraid I can't tell you very much about him. Until I saw him at the inquest I had not met him since I was a boy. But he is a very different kind of man from Uncle Geoffrey, different in appearance and different in character." "You would say that the two brothers were physically quite unlike, then?" "Well," said Stephen, "I don't know that I ought to say that. Perhaps I am exaggerating the difference. I am thinking of Uncle Geoffrey as he was when I saw him last, and of Uncle John as he appeared at the inquest. They were very different then. Geoffrey was thin, pale, clean shaven, wore spectacles and walked with a stoop. John is a shade taller, a shade grayer, has good eyesight, a healthy florid complexion, a brisk, upright carriage, is distinctly stout, and wears a beard and moustache which are black and only very slightly streaked with grey. To me they looked as unlike as two men could, although their features are really of the same type. Indeed, I have heard it said that, as young men, they were rather alike, and they both resembled their mother. But there is no doubt as to their difference in character. Geoffrey was quiet, serious, and studious, whereas John rather inclined to what is called a fast life. He used to frequent race meetings, and, I think, gambled a good deal at times." "What is his profession?" "That would be difficult to tell. He has so many. He is so very versatile. I believe he began life as an articled pupil in the laboratory of a large brewery, but he soon left that and went on the stage. He seems to have remained in the profession for some years, touring about this country and making occasional visits to America. The life seemed to suit him, and I believe he was decidedly successful as an actor. But suddenly he left the stage and blossomed out in connection with a bucket shop in London." "And what is he doing now?" "At the inquest he described himself as a stockbroker, so I presume he is still connected with the bucket shop." Thorndyke rose, and taking down from the reference shelves a list of members of the Stock Exchange, turned over the leaves. "Yes," he said, replacing the volume, "he must be an outside broker. His name is not in the list of members of the House. From what you tell me, it is easy to understand that there should have been no great intimacy between the two brothers, without assuming any kind of ill feeling. They simply had very little in common. Do you know of anything more?" "No. I have never heard of any actual quarrel or disagreement. My impression that they did not get on very well may have been, I think, due to the terms of the will, especially the first will, and they certainly did not seek one another's society." "That is not very conclusive," said Thorndyke. "As to the will, a thrifty man is not usually much inclined to bequeath his savings to a gentleman who may probably employ them in a merry little flutter on the turf or the stock exchange. And then there was yourself, clearly a more suitable subject for a legacy, as your life is all before you. But this is mere speculation, and the matter is not of much importance as far as we can see. And now, tell me what John Blackmore's relations were with Mrs. Wilson. I gather that she left the bulk of her property to Geoffrey, her younger brother. Is that so?" "Yes, she left nothing to John. The fact is that they were hardly on speaking terms. I believe John had treated her rather badly, or, at any rate, she thought he had. Mr. Wilson, her late husband, dropped some money over an investment in connection with the bucket shop that I spoke of, and I think she suspected John of having let him in. She may have been mistaken, but you know what ladies are when they get an idea into their heads." "Did you know your aunt well?" "No, very slightly. She lived down in Devonshire and saw very little of any of us. She was a taciturn, strong-minded woman, quite unlike her brothers. She seems to have resembled her father's family." "You might give me her full name." "Julia Elizabeth Wilson. Her husband's name was Edmund Wilson." "Thank you. There is just one more point. What has happened to your uncle's chambers in New Inn since his death?" "They have remained shut up. As all his effects were left to me, I have taken over the tenancy for the present to avoid having them disturbed. I thought of keeping them for my own use, but I don't think I could live in them after what I have seen." "You have inspected them, then?" "Yes, I have just looked through them. I went there on the day of the inquest." "Now, tell me, as you looked through those rooms, what kind of impression did they convey to you as to your uncle's habits and mode of life?" Stephen smiled apologetically. "I'm afraid," said he, "that they did not convey any particular impression in that respect. I looked into the sitting room and saw all his old familiar household gods, and then I went into the bedroom and saw the impression on the bed where his corpse had lain, and that gave me such a sensation of horror that I came away at once." "But the appearance of the rooms must have conveyed something to your mind," Thorndyke urged. "I'm afraid it did not. You see, I have not your analytical eye. But perhaps you would like to look through them yourself? If you would, pray do so. They're my chambers now." "I think I should like to glance round them," Thorndyke replied. "Very well," said Stephen. "I will give you my card now, and I will look in at the lodge presently and tell the porter to hand you the key whenever you like to look over the rooms." He took a card from his case, and, having written a few lines on it, handed it to Thorndyke. "It is very good of you," he said, "to take so much trouble. Like Mr. Marchmont, I have no expectation of any result from your efforts, but I am very grateful to you, all the same, for going into the case so thoroughly. I suppose you don't see any possibility of upsetting that will, if I may ask the question?" "At present," replied Thorndyke, "I do not. But until I have carefully weighed every fact connected with the case, whether it seems to have any bearing or not, I shall refrain from expressing or even entertaining an opinion either way." Stephen Blackmore now took his leave, and Thorndyke, having collected the papers containing his notes, neatly punched a couple of holes in their margins and inserted them into a small file which he slipped into his pocket. "That," said he, "is the nucleus of the body of data on which our investigations must be based, and I very much fear that it will not receive any great additions. What do you think, Jervis?" "The case looks about as hopeless as a case could look," I replied. "That is what I think," said he, "and for that reason I am more than ordinarily keen on making something of it. I have not much more hope than Marchmont has, but I shall squeeze the case as dry as a bone before I let it go. What are you going to do?" "I have to attend a meeting of the board of directors of the Griffin Life Office." "Shall I walk down with you?" "It is very good of you to offer, Jervis, but I think I will go alone. I want to run over these notes and get the facts of the case arranged in my mind. When I have done that I shall be ready to pick up new matter. Knowledge is of no use unless it is actually in your mind, so that it can be produced at a moment's notice. So you had better get a book and your pipe and spend a quiet hour by the fire while I assimilate the miscellaneous mental feast that we have just enjoyed. And you might do a little rumination yourself." With this Thorndyke took his departure, and I, adopting his advice, drew my chair closer to the fire and filled my pipe. But I did not discover any inclination to read. The curious history that I had just heard, and Thorndyke's evident determination to elucidate it further, disposed me to meditation. Moreover, as his subordinate, it was my business to occupy myself with his affairs. Wherefore, having stirred the fire and got my pipe well alight, I abandoned myself to the renewed consideration of the facts relating to Geoffrey Blackmore's will. Chapter 7